So, yeah, I'm Jack Vanlightly, so I've just been specialising in messaging systems, all types of systems, mostly RabbitMQ and Kafka. I've been involved in testing a lot. Most of my RabbitMQ stuff this year has been testing. Started out with correctness testing of Quorum queues and single active consumer, and now it's branched out into performance testing, and most recently I've been stress testing Quorum queues and trying to make it break. So I really like breaking stuff. It's nice to be paid to break stuff. So what is performance? With message queue, we're really looking at throughput, so that's messages in and out, megabytes in and out, and we're looking at the end-to-end latency, the time between when a message is published to when it's consumed. And we've got a bunch of conditions. We've just got loads and loads, and we're just going to explore all these different types of scenarios and loads of features. We'll just see how many features we can get through. There are too many features to combine to include in the 40-minute talk, so we won't try. But I've tried to pick what I think is interesting, and hopefully you'll find it interesting as well. And also, I want to kind of put things in perspective, because a lot of the time I'm going to be talking about 10,000 messages a second or 100,000 a second. But, you know, what is your daily volume? Who has, say, 100,000 messages per day? What about 1 million, 10 million? Is that the region? Anyone get more, like 1 billion? Anyone with 1 billion? Okay, so there's a few who might hit, you know, 10,000 messages a second. Obviously you have peaks in there as well, so you might even have just periods of the time where you hit many per second, but you know, probably most people actually are more in the million range or 10 million, and so you know, it's really not that many per second. But we're going to be exploring kind of what the limits are of RabbitMQ with the different configurations and features and seeing where it goes. And I've got two example clusters. I've got a C5 9x large, so that's EC2, so it's 36 cores, 72 gigs of RAM, and a 10 gigabit network. And another one, which is C4 4x large, which has 16 CPUs and less RAM and stuff. And I went for the C4 4x large because it doesn't have any burst, and you'll have a lot of burst with smaller instance types on Amazon, and I don't want to run out of burst and then suddenly throughput goes like that. It just ruins your benchmarks. Whereas the C5 9x large is the smallest one of the C5 range, which doesn't have burst. So, and I apologize to my employers for spending all the money on running all these benchmarks because they get a bit expensive. Anyway, so let's have a look at exchanges. So, a single publisher to an exchange, that goes nowhere. I mean, you publish it to the exchange, there's no queues bound, not very useful, but it's interesting to know what is the throughput limit of an exchange. I just chose a fan out because it's like one of the fastest, and we see that single publisher on our smaller server, that's a 4th generation CPU, whereas the bigger server has got 6th generation, so it's got more cores and each core has got better single threaded performance. And we see that a single publisher can do up to almost 150,000 on these two machines. But that's just one publisher. It's not to say that's all that this particular exchange can do. It can do more. If I add more publishers, I do 1 million a second. That's pretty good, isn't it? They go nowhere. No one gets any messages. But it's interesting to see that the exchange itself is usually not the bottleneck. So let's have a look at sending all the way to a queue. So we've got one publisher, sends to an exchange, there's one queue bound, and there's one consumer. Right, we're going to play Spot the Exchange. We've got 3 topic exchanges, one where we're doing exact match, one's using star, one's using hash. On a binding key, we've got a headers exchange with one header. We've got, let me see, a fan out, a direct, and the default exchange. Right, think in your heads, work out, and let's see if you're surprised. Well, personally, I had never done a huge amount of performance testing of RabbitMQ before I started at Pivotal, and I was really surprised about the topic exchange. Being the slowest here, I really expected headers to come in slower. Now, I'm not saying that the topic doesn't scale out better. You know, if you have 1,000 topic exchanges, maybe that does better than 1,000 headers. And also, the headers exchange does start to drop as you add headers. The more headers you add, it does start dropping, but it still does reasonably well against topic. And the default exchange is by far the fastest, even though it's also a direct exchange. For some reason, which my colleagues in the team could probably tell us, it's a lot faster. So then we got the fan out, which is, this is, as we saw in the Cloud AMQP talk, most messages end up getting delivered to more than one queue. So here we're just going to look at a little test where we start out with a publisher doing 1,000 messages a second, and we just start adding queues to our fan out. And we just see how far we can go. So at the bottom here, we see queue count, so we're starting to add queues, and the little blue at the bottom, that's the publish rate for both of our servers. So we've got remember we've got the big server and we've got the medium size, and we see that the outgoing is keeping in lockstep with the queue count. That's basically telling us that Rabbit is handling no problem. At the end there, 1,000 messages in, 10,000 out, there's not a problem. What if we take it further? We see that now at 100, both of our servers are handling it. We're getting 1,000 in and 100,000 out. I have to point out I was using a modded version of perftest for my own purposes, and my rate limiter is a little off. It's about 10% out, so you'll see that the numbers are just out a little bit. It should be 100,000, but it goes about 10% more. Now, as we start adding more and more, and we're getting up to 200 queues, we see that the larger server, it's topped out at about 150 queues. 1,000 messages in, 150,000 out, and it can't do any more. Whereas the smaller server is kind of topped out at 110 queues. So there is a limit to how much you can go in and out. And what about latency? So in this test, we have a single publisher, and we start publishing 10 messages a second, and then we 20, and then 30, and we're slowly increasing the rate, and then we start doing it 100 more, 100 more, 100 more, and we end up on about 1,000 messages a second, and we just see what the end-to-end latency, how that grows. On the top, we've got our smaller server. On the bottom, we've got our larger server. And this is how the different types of exchange cope with it. And we see that the direct and fan out are just a little bit better there at 1 second and 1.5 second latencies. And headers is looking like the worst. But you can definitely see it grow as we start increasing the message size, the message rate. But still, it's only about a millisecond to a millisecond and a half when we reach 1,000 messages a second. But that was the 50th and 75th and the 95th percentile. But what about the 99th and then 99th.9th? We see some bigger peaks. Headers has definitely got the higher tail latencies, and direct and fan out seem to have the lowest, and topic's not doing too bad either. Okay, what about the consistent hash exchange? So this has been mentioned, was mentioned in the WeWork, and I think mentioned somewhere else. And so what is it exactly? So it's just a way of scaling out a queue. Now, why would you do that? Maybe you reach the throughput limit of a single queue. We saw that through the default exchange, we were able to publish in the region of 70 to 90,000 a second. Those are very small messages, but that's about the limit you'll get of your queue. And if you have more than that, then you'll need to publish to multiple queues. So that's one reason to use it. Another reason is maybe you've got slow consumers. You might have quite a slow number of messages in. Maybe you only got 1 a second or 100 a second, but it takes you a second or 5 minutes to process a message, and you want some ordering guarantees when you process it. Because if you add competing consumers on the same queue, you get delivery in the right order, but you don't necessarily get any guarantees about processing order. So that's another reason to use it, and that would have solved WeWork's situation. There's nothing wrong with doing it yourself. So one interesting aspect of the consistent hash exchange is it actually gets slower for a single publisher as you scale out the number of queues you've bound to it. So here we've got one queue, and it's managing 75 for the big server, 65 for the little one. Then we add a second queue, and whoa, look, throughput's just gone down loads. So, well, that's not very useful, is it? But also take into account that one of the use cases is not to actually increase your total throughput, it's to allow consumers to scale out while maintaining ordering. But this is definitely something to take into account, and the reason is, most likely, or one of the contributing reasons, is the multiple flag, or that's at least in the confirms we'll see, because we get the same kind of behavior with confirms. With the more queues you add, the less multiple flag usage the broker can make use of, so it becomes less efficient. But, oh yeah, and then we can see as we add more and more, at the end there we've got 1,000 queues bound to our single exchange, and the throughput of a single publisher has gone down to like 5,000. So something to take into account that you need to be aware of. If you've just got a very fast publisher, just one, then take that into account. But that's just one publisher. If you've got more publishers, we don't have this problem. In fact, when we have 10 publishers, we actually see that we're reaching almost 350,000 messages a second with 4 queues bound to our exchange. And then after that, it starts to degrade again. So with RabbitMQ, you'll find that depending on your workload and your hardware, scaling out your queues, you get higher and higher and higher total throughput, and then it will start going down again. And the degree it goes up and down is workload dependent. But here we see we've got 10 publishers, and we're just slowly increasing the number of queues. And we also see that our big server really takes advantage here. And the latency, we see much higher latencies with the smaller server, around 3 seconds. They're all quite bunched together, the 50th, 75th, up to 99.9th. And this is another thing we'll see from the consistent hash exchange and the Sharding plugin, is that the latencies can be a bit higher, but they are all bunched together. You don't get huge tail latency spikes. And our big server is coming in at 1 a second, even when doing 350,000 messages per second. Right, so confirms in X. That was all without any confirms in X, so you will lose messages anytime your connection fails, and connections fail all the time. So, we've got replication, mirrored queues and quorum queues in case a node goes down, but how often do nodes go down? Not that often. How often do connections fail? All the time. So you really, if you care about your messages, want to use confirms. But they do take a bit of a hit when it comes to your overall throughput. But remember, we've got here 100,000 messages a second at the end there with 10 queues, and that's still quite a lot, right? And you'll notice that the smaller server in yellow at the top there, it tops out and then it just hits a wall and then it just goes down. So, whereas the larger server just keeps going. If we kept on adding queues, we'd see it dip again. So there is an optimum. If you have a total throughput of your broker, there is an optimum number for a particular workload, an optimum number of queues, depending on your hardware. So we've taken a bit of hit with throughput, but at least in this case, the latency is quite similar. Around about a second, a bit over a second, and about 3 seconds for the smaller server. But that's a very high throughput. So the Sharding plugin is an alternate to the consistent hashing exchange. So you can use a X modulus hash exchange, which more or less does a very similar thing, uses hashing function to route to different queues, and so you have one exchange. And the difference with the Sharding plugin is it does a lot for you. It will auto-create your queues. You kind of treat all those queues as one logical queue, so you only publish to one queue, and in the background there might be 10 or 20 or 30 queues. But your clients don't realize that. And we see the single publisher slowdown also happens with the Sharding plugin, but it's not nearly as severe. And so as we are adding queues here, up to 10 at the end, we've had a slight throughput drop. But as we've got 10, here we have 10 publishers, we see actually, again, we get a massive, actually the peak performance is at about 5 queues with 400,000 messages a second, and then it starts dipping again. And latency is basically identical to the hash exchange. And with confirms, again, we're seeing the same thing. The larger server, it's able to cope with the extra queues that get added and just keeps on asking for more. If we carried on, no doubt it would start dipping, but our smaller server does start taking a hit. So it is important to kind of do these experiments to work out what size servers you want. Because if you don't need to be spending $3,000 a month on the big one, then there's no point wasting money. And again, very similar latencies. You see at the end there, the latency starts going up, and that's because we saw the big dip in throughput as the smaller server was struggling to cope. And as it struggles to cope, latency goes up. Whereas the bigger server just carried on coping, and actually latencies were going lower and lower the more queues we added. But what about competing consumers? Do we really want to jump onto scaling out queues, which is a lot more complexity? When do we want to just add consumers? It's so easy, it's really the easiest thing is just to add consumers. If you haven't reached the throughput limit of a single queue, then you should probably do that. The only time you might not want to do it is when ordering is very, very important. Because you do lose your ordering guarantees of processing. When you have competing consumers, all different prefetches, there's no guarantees you'll get perfect ordering when you process them. Whereas if you've sharded your queue and maybe you have a single consumer, you could use the single active consumer or the exclusive consumer feature and get Kafka-like functionality to replicate how it does topics and partitions. You can do that. So what about latency? Let's just say we have 10,000 messages a second, okay? And each consumer takes 5 milliseconds to process every message. So that means we need about 50 consumers to keep up with the producer, okay? We'll go for 100 just to make sure, okay? And in one, we've got 100 queues bound to a consistent hash exchange, and each queue has a single consumer. Or we have a single queue, and we have 100 consumers all consuming off that single queue. Now, which one's going to have the better latency? We know that they'll both be able to handle the 10,000 messages a second. Well, competing consumers by far are better. We're getting around 1 millisecond with the 99 percentile peaking at about 4. Whereas we get this pattern with both the consistent hash exchange and the sharding plugin. You do get more latency. It is more or less close together. We don't tend to get huge spikes with either, but you do get higher latency. So, take these things into account. If latency is very, very important to you, I would argue normally 30 seconds and 30 milliseconds is not a big deal, but it's all depending on your situation. Right, so what about a single queue? So we looked at some exchanges. What about a single queue? So without confirms, auto-ack, it's just all fire and forget. If we lose some messages, then no worries. We've got one publisher, keeps increasing its publisher rate higher and higher and higher until it gets to a target of 100,000 a second. And we see that the smaller server kind of can't quite manage towards the end, and the bigger server kind of manages to keep up. And that's going to be down to the single core performance of 4th gen versus 6th gen on the CPU, because it's just a single queue. The latency spikes at the end for both, because they both get to a point where they're struggling. Because when you reach the throughput limit of a queue, latency, there's no guarantees. But if we look at before it started struggling, latency is pretty good. 50th to 99th point night feel rather close together. They do increase as we increase the publishing rate. But what about message size? So in this test, we start with very small messages, 16 bytes, and we double it and double it and double it. And we just see what happens to throughput. Up until a kilobyte, both are managing more or less stable throughput. And then end up pushing around 80 megs a second of message body. The total throughput will be higher, but that's of the message body. If we zoom out a bit and continue the test, doubling it until we get to a megabyte, we see throughput drops considerably for both. And you might be thinking, oh dear, RabbitMQ doesn't deal very well with large messages, does it? But let's just have a look at the throughput of megabytes. We're actually pushing a gigabyte a second through a single queue. And the only reason we can't push more is because we actually reach network saturation. In fact, the top one is more or less, it didn't quite saturate the network. The bottom one, you see that straight line? If you're ever doing stuff in cloud and you suddenly see a straight line, you've hit some limit. And the limit here is the actual network limit of the instance, which is 5 gigabits. So a single queue can, without replication, without anything, you send bigger messages fast enough. A single queue can actually saturate your network. But let's not, be so carefree with our messages. Let's actually have some security. We'll have some publisher confirms to make sure they actually get delivered. We'll just keep with the auto ACK, and we'll just look at confirms. So when we've got virtually no latency, this is just a 3-node cluster. Everything's in the same availability zone, very low latency. And what we're going to do is we're going to slowly increase our in-flight limit. I call that's like the number of unconfirmed messages that you can have at a time. So your publisher is sending messages, and then the broker's sending confirms. And you just make sure you don't exceed some limit of the number of unconfirmed you have at a time. And we see that as we allow our publisher to have more and more unconfirmed messages at a time, we see an increase in throughput. And it peaks at around 15 to 20. But if we add some latency, this is round trip. It's not, we don't publish and then wait and publish. We've got a stream of publishing and a stream of confirms coming in, but it's a round trip, and round trips are very sensitive to latency. So with just 5 milliseconds of latency, we're seeing a direct benefit in throughput as we're increasing our in-flight limit. And we keep increasing it, and we keep seeing that direct jump in throughput. In fact, we have to go to, in this case, with just 5 milliseconds, to about, 300, 400 in-flight max. Now, if you take that to 10 milliseconds, or 20, or 50, it just, you need to have a higher and higher in-flight max to become immune to the latency. And you can become immune to the latency. You can actually set it high enough such that it doesn't penalize you. Now, on the consumer side, we also have the same mechanism. We have acknowledgements, and we also have prefetch. So prefetch is the same as what I call the in-flight max, but on the consumer side. So this is the number of unacked messages the broker will let you have on that channel. And so we see that these two got a bit out of sync, these two tests, but we see that we get benefit. This is with no latency, up to about a prefetch of about 5. And after that, we don't really see any, we set the prefetch to 10 or 20 or 100 or even 1,000. We don't really see any benefit after that, at least on this unreplicated queue. But if we add some latency, now we can start seeing that prefetch, higher and higher prefetch is actually very beneficial. And we actually start topping out at about 150, say. But that's ACKing every single message. So we're sending an ACK for every single one. But there's a better way. There's the multiple flag. So we could send ACK every 10 messages, set the multiple flag, and you've just ACKed 10 messages just in one operation. So we're hitting, about 8,000 a second. Let's set the ACK interval to 10% of our prefetch. So if we have a prefetch of 100, then every 10th message we'll send an ACK with a multiple flag. And so we see that we get higher throughput. We're peaking at about 13, and the prefetch, it's about, approaching 200 with an ACK interval of 20. So this is with 5 milliseconds of latency. So again, if you had more latency, it'd be higher. What is the optimum? Well, let's use the multiple flag even more. Let's do it at 50%, so that we send even less ACKs. Well, actually, we've dropped throughput now. Because by setting such a high, sending so few acts, we've kind of effectively dropped our prefetch a bit. Because, RabbitMQ sends a bunch of messages, we wait, and then we say, hey, we've got 1,000, and RabbitMQ is like, whoa, 1,000, right, I need to send you more, rather than doing it kind of in a more streaming way. So you can actually set it too high. So if we've got, say, a prefetch of 200, and we start with 10%, so about ACK interval of 20, then 40, then 60, that's pretty optimum. We're hitting our max throughput. When we hit about 40 to 50%, it drops, and then towards the end there, well, if our prefetch is 200, and I want to wait to get 210 messages, it's not going to go well. I'm just going to end up waiting forever and not consuming anything. So we end up dropping to 0 throughput. So be careful with that. So at least with this 5 milliseconds, 0 and 5, yeah. So this all went through Proxy, so I could simulate latency. So I don't know if Proxy ended up slowing things down, but at least in these two tests, 0 latency at the top, 5 milliseconds at the bottom, with very high prefetch and in-flight, we made ourselves immune to the latency. Actually, the higher latency didn't actually cost us any throughput at all. So depending on your latency, you need to think about your optimum settings. Right, queues again. So what about the lazy queue? Who here uses a lazy queue? Few. Okay, Cloud AMQP do advise them because one of the most common problems they see is memory. And so lazy queues are great because they just write to disk straight away and evict it from memory. And so if you've got any problems with memory, then you can avoid a lot of those with lazy queues. What happens when you reach your memory limit? Your publishers get throttled, and they can get throttled a lot, which is very bad for performance. So we really want to avoid running out of memory. Running a few benchmarks, we got very similar for our increasing publisher rate, very similar latencies. They're able to push the gigabyte of messages. I mean, this queue is behaving just as well as a classic normal queue, at least in this benchmark. But it has a very different memory profile. So the first queue is not lazy, it is a normal queue, and we publish 3 million messages, which is quite a lot. But look at that, it dropped by 14 gigabytes our available memory. Then I deleted the queue, and it got it all back. The lazy queue, look at that, a little spike, and another little spike at the end. Look at the difference in memory usage. In this test, I publish 1 million, I rest, and then consume 1 million. You see a little blip there and a little blip. So we get a blip when the messages are kind of moving, but when it's at rest, it's flat. And with the normal queue, we get a massive drop during the publishing. It recovers, goes flat, but we're still a gigabyte less than we had before. And then again, a little dip when we start consuming it. And this is with 10 million. Just to show in the yellow there, that's the period of activity. And we can see that it's more costly in memory to publish than it is when we consume for the normal queue. But it's just a little tiny blip there for the lazy queue. So, lazy queues probably, you want fast disks because disk might be your bottleneck with lazy queues. But one of the most common problems with Rabbit is memory. So consider lazy queues. And in fact, you see here, I actually had faster lazy than normal because I published my messages a lot faster. I didn't actually end up looking into why that was. So yeah, you get a single queue limit. You can saturate your network or your disk depending on what type of queue you're using. Publisher confirms NX do reduce your throughput, but if you get your prefetch and your X right, then you can limit that drop. And yeah, consider lazy queues to avoid memory problems. But what about replicated queues? So normally we don't talk about replicated queues with RabbitMQ, we talk about mirrored queues, but now we've got two types of replicated queue. So I'll just be using that more generic term. Let's have a look at a mirrored queue. Okay, it's just one queue on a 3-node cluster. What's its throughput and latencies? So we can go for different replication factors. So on the end there, we have a 5-node cluster. And you actually see for one node, throughput doesn't drop too much. It's actually not bad, going from 2 to 3 to 5. Latencies in the 50th and 75th are all very similar. At the top there, we have our smaller server. The bottom is our bigger server. And we go from 2 to 3 to 5 replication. So that's 5 would be 1 mirror and 1 master and 4 mirrors. So it's not looking too bad. But what you'll see with mirrored queues is the tail latencies. It's got quite high tail latencies. That's where you're going to see your surprises when it comes to latency. It gets worse as we have a higher factor. We even see the blue line, which is the 95th percentile coming in there, and we actually getting 250 milliseconds. What about our larger messages? We're able to push a gigabyte a second on a single node, unreplicated. So with a replication factor of 2, that's down to 250 to 200. It's quite a drop. To 3, we go down to 150 for the smaller one. And you see it's flat, flat, flat. We're saturating our network in every single case, because even with a single node, we were able to saturate it. But the throughput at which we reach when we saturate the network gets lower and lower and lower. So you can saturate your network very easily. What about quorum queues? What does that look like? So not bad. We're actually able to hit 30,000 messages a second on the big one for just one queue with a replication factor of 3. And that goes down to 21. So that's actually a bit faster than our mirrored queues. The latencies slightly higher here on the 50th and 75th percentile, but more interestingly for me, the tail latencies are a lot lower. And you will see this in benchmark after benchmark. Quorum queues have much more stable and predictable latencies, okay? That's something which is seen over and over again. What about message size? So again, we pay the price for replication factor, 250 to 150 here, and lower again. So replication costs, basically. So replicated queues, choose well when you want to replicate. Make sure that it's necessary. If you do have a high throughput, most of you probably don't have huge high throughputs, and you'll probably have nothing to lose from replicating. But if you do have higher throughputs, then beware that the more you replicate, the lower latencies, sorry, the higher latencies and lower throughputs you'll see. But you do get some more stable latencies with quorum queues, which is nice. Okay, so what about multiple queues? So far we've been looking at like one queue. We looked at a few multiple queue scenarios with the consistent hash exchange. But what about if we've just got a bunch of queues which are independent of each other and they're just hosted on the same broker? How does large amounts of queues do with RabbitMQ? Well, we can see that the large cluster there carries on. We end up with 1,000 queues with a target of 200 messages a second. So, and it manages it. It reaches to 200,000 messages a second. It is starting to struggle. You'll see the dips. When it's not struggling, it will just be flat. It will just be stable. And the more it struggles, the more you'll see this. You might see publisher and consumer rates diverge. That's when you know Rabbit's struggling. And the smaller server tanks a lot faster. What's the optimum number of queues? So here we see that actually between, say, 5 and 50 queues is where it's kind of got the same amount of performance, and then it starts going down. And the more and more and more queues you add, the lower the total throughput that you'll get. But what about confirms and acts? What about that? So again, we start adding queues with a target of 200 messages per queue, and we reach our limits very much earlier with publisher confirms and acts. You see the divergence of publisher and consumer rates. That's quite common when you put Rabbit under a lot of stress, and you really want them to be together, or your queue is going to be backing up. So you see that they struggle a lot sooner. So yeah, 5 to 50 queues, and we see that with large number of queues, our larger server with more cores did a lot better. So it was able to use those extra cores quite well. What about a cluster? Let's say we reach our limit on our single, and we want to scale out, and we want a cluster. So we just add nodes, right? And we just get linear scaling. Nothing will go wrong. So here we've got 3 brokers, and so we've got the same test. We just add queues, keep adding queues, 200 messages a second per queue. And this time, you'll notice that our smaller server, which tanked halfway through, made it all the way to the end successfully. Publish confirms, again, it dropped much sooner. What about 5? So again, obviously, 5 handled the left-hand one. So the left-hand one, if I didn't make that clear, is without publish confirms, and the one on the right is with confirms and X. And you see, actually, look at the difference on the confirms and X one. We see a big difference. It really handles it a lot better with 5. So scaling out worked. What about, so we know many queues, you reduce your total throughput. So let's try fewer queues with a higher rate per queue. So 1,000 messages a second, 500 queues. We reach a limit there with both, and note that they both struggle at the same time. 36 cores did not help there. But we're still seeing the benefit of 36 cores with the confirms. And with 5, again, we are getting no benefit from 5 brokers with 1,000 queues without confirms. There is some limit. Maybe it's Erlang itself. I'm not sure, actually. But we reach a limit. But with the confirms, it keeps going. And we'll see this again and again. When you use confirms, the more and more you scale out, the more you'll get. What about 100 queues? Now we're getting to the sweet spot. So we're reaching 400,000 messages a second. I don't know why in this test, and I did repeat it a few times. Our smaller server actually did better than our larger server, except when it came to publisher confirms and X. And yet again, our larger server with more cores did far better, far better. And also is quite respectably at 250,000 messages a second at around 40 queues. 5 brokers. Again, no real benefit to the extra nodes there when we're not using confirms. But we do get a big benefit, again, and we're close to 350,000 messages a second with confirms and X, which is pretty good. But I've been cheating. We talked a bit about data locality in the talk, and in the panel. And that basically means that if our queue is on broker 2, then if we connect to that broker, we'll get really good throughput. But if we just connect randomly, we might rope in a bunch of servers to serve a single queue. If we end up having the publisher connects to broker 1, that traffic will get routed to 2, and then the consumer connects to 3, and then that needs to get, and so now all 3 brokers are serving 1 queue. And what scalability benefits does that really give us? Let's have a look. So back to the 1,000 queue test. Check this out. 1 broker, 3 brokers. 1, 3, 1, 3. This is when I didn't cheat. I just randomized the brokers through a load balancer, and we didn't actually get any benefit from 3 brokers at all. But what about with confirms and X? Because we always see a completely different profile when we use those. So this time, look, we hit 100,000 before it all went wrong, before RabbitMQ got overwhelmed. If we compare with 1 broker, 15,000, 100,000. So even though we're not connecting to the local, we're still benefiting when we're using confirms. It's just, RabbitMQ has to do a lot more. It's managing, a lot more, doing a lot more. And so we don't see the drain and the loss of throughput. So when we're not using confirms and X, we don't always see a larger benefit of a larger server when using it in a cluster. We probably won't see linear improvement in scale. Connecting to your local broker, you'll get much better latency, much better throughput. And with confirms in X, we still benefit. We still benefit even if you don't connect to the local one. Okay, back to the consistent hash exchange and a cluster this time. So with the one broker, we were able to reach almost 350,000 messages a second. What about 3? Well, we didn't improve. We didn't improve on our peak because we just seem to have reached the limit that Erlang can handle on that cluster. But the good news is as we've scaled out our queues, kind of more or less maintained our throughput. With the single broker, it starts dipping and dipping and dipping, but we're able to maintain the kind of total throughput that the cluster is capable of much better. But what happens when you don't connect to the local? I cheated again, I'm sorry. This top one is when you just randomize the node that you connect to. This here on the left is when I connected always to the local broker of the queue for both publisher and consumer. Oh, no, not the publisher, but just the consumer. And that's when I don't. Okay? So, and this is something where the Sharding plugin has a bit of an edge, because the Sharding plugin will actually assign you a queue that is local. So that is actually something where the Sharding plugin has an edge. What do we got here? Confirms in X. Yeah. So this is when we connect to the local broker with confirms in X. As we add queues, we keep getting the benefit. So again and again, when we're using the confirms, because there's a lot more work to be done, we always seem to be benefiting when we scale out. Yeah, so look at that. That was with one broker. This is with 3. 1, 3, 1, 3. So the smaller server definitely sees an improvement when we're using a cluster. And the Sharding plugin. So at the top, that was what a single broker looked like. And at the bottom, well, it's a bit different now, because with the Sharding plugin, it will deploy a certain number of queues per node. So if we say 1 queue per node, then we've got 3 nodes, then we'll have 3 queues. If we say 3 queues per node, we'll end up with 9. So we've got 3, 6, and 9 queues, and we see that it remains pretty flat. We've reached some kind of limit, some wall, but we're able to maintain that as we scale out. Right, so with one broker, we saw, and again, so this is, with the top broker, that's the number of queues. We got 1, 2, 3, up to 10. But on this one, we've got a number per node. So we actually got 3, 6, 9, 12, all the way up to 30 queues. And so we actually see that on a cluster, we actually see that drop a lot later. It's really when we hit about 27 queues that we actually see a big drop. So just to go back to the Sharding plugin and consistent hash exchange, so just take into account there are limits, there are optimum numbers of queues, and measure with perf test. Well, what about replicated queues? So the mirrored queue, let's have a look. Throughput with no rate limit, we'll be using confirms in X because there's no sense in not using them. You obviously care about your data, and without confirms in X, you will daily lose messages. What's it capable of? When we've got a replication factor of 2, we're able to hit almost 50,000 messages, okay? And when we move that to a replication factor of 3, it goes down quite dramatically. What about when we have a 5-node cluster? Looking pretty good, almost hitting 120,000 messages a second with mirrored queues, which is not bad. And then as we increase the replication factor, that goes down and down and down. In the end, we've got 5 nodes, and all 5 are involved in every single message. So we get no scaling, but we do get safety. So that's the trade-off. With what's this one? This is with more queues. So we had many fewer queues. This is with 500 queues. And we see again that it's less efficient. When we have many more queues, we get lower throughput. So it definitely prefers less queues than 500. But when we add more brokers, it deals much better. So we're definitely seeing that scaling out a cluster when we use mirrored queues seems to help. Quorum queues. So we saw that a single quorum queue tends to outperform a mirrored queue, but what about when we add more and more of them? So here we got 1, and we're seeing a very respectable performance there. We had 2, it doubles. Then we got 3 and 4, and then we stopped seeing any benefit. We're not scaling out any further. And you'll also notice that we're not getting any benefit from our 36 cores. Right? We're paying all that money, but we're not getting any benefit. But what do they both have in common? They've got both the same disk. They've got an IO1 SSD with 10,000 IOPS. And we're hitting the disk limit because Quorum queues are writing everything to disk. And so it really doesn't make sense to be having all those cores anymore. Unless, of course, we scale out our disks enough that we might be able to benefit again from the cores. What about, so we got less queues here. Oh yeah, so we saw that it seemed to be about 4. It was hard to tell. So here we had a queue, and we see it is around 4 queues that it seems to reach the limit on this particular. These are not, this is all just one example, okay? So don't go away thinking that every single installation will have this same behavior. And almost at the end here. So what about 5 breakers? We've got a replication factor of 3. We're hitting around 60,000. That's a bit lower. We're about 75,000 for our mirrored queues. But that was 75,000 with our big servers. Our smaller server managed about 40,000. So we actually see that it's actually more cost effective with our smaller server because we actually get higher throughput with the smaller server type, but we get lower throughput with the larger server. And then with a replication factor of 5, again, throughput has dropped even more. And we can see that when we do a 10 queue test, it's about 4 or 5 queues, and on the 5, it's about 3 queues that we reach our limit. And right, so again, we've got 500 queues in the end here. We reach our limit at about 150. So it does get rather flat. You'll notice a little dip there. You might see another one here. Can anyone guess what that dip is about? It's memory. Quorum queues, I didn't put any resource limits on these queues, and by default, it stores everything in memory. What happens when your queue gets bigger? Your memory gets exhausted, memory alarms kick in, and your publishers get throttled. So this is where it actually got throttled, and you see the big drop, and it got throttled on the other one as well. But the bigger server that had 70 gigs of RAM, it did not get throttled at all. So Quorum queues, it depends. You can get higher throughput than mirrored. Potentially, you might be able to scale out mirrored more, but it all depends on the queue side, on the server and the workload. I've managed to demonstrate that depending on the server, I can actually make Quorum queues perform better or worse than mirrored. And yeah, 20 to 100 queues was the optimum for mirrored, and 3 to 4 was Quorum. So, but what do I want you to take away from this? We've seen a bunch of different things. The point is who could have predicted everything we saw then? And who could predict all the things that all the different combinations of features? It's very, very hard to predict. You've got different hardware, you've got different everything. And so you really need to use perf tests, use the new observability features to work out how to best choose your server type, the configuration, everything. Because there's a big difference in cost. If you over-provision, you might be spending $3,000 a month, when really you could have done with maybe one C5 2x large for 200. You just don't know. You need to work that out and measure. So yeah, and don't forget the awesome new observability features to help you measure. And that's it. Any questions?
I think we've got time for just one, possibly 2 questions.
Sorry, very quick question. What was the message size in the last Quorum tests?
16 bytes. Or a kilobyte, can't remember. It's very similar. I think it's 16 bytes. Most of them were 16 bytes. Actually, no, I'm lying. Sorry, it's 1 kilobyte. I remember now. It was 1 kilobyte.
Very last question. So this is the very last question I've been told. So, Jack, how can people reproduce similar tests for their workloads, have all of those nice charts, and hopefully come to some conclusions and improve their infrastructure?
Well, perf test comes with, you can do everything I did there in perf test. Mine was slightly modified because I just wanted a few more metrics that perf test doesn't currently have, but we will be adding them soon, like the queue counts and consumer counts and stuff like that. But then saying that, you get that now on the new dashboards, so you can pretty much do everything you need through the new Grafana dashboards. There's one specifically for perf test, so you can see everything perf test is doing, you can see everything your server is doing. So it's just a matter of learning perf test. Perf test sometimes is a bit hard to configure. You just need to spend a little time learning how the command line arguments, all the arguments work, but it's worth it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Jack, for an excellent reference talk. Let's take a few minutes just to prepare for the next talk.